Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we will be learning how to add constraints to our data. The purpose of a constraint is to restrict the type of data that can go into a table. This will ensure the accuracy and reliability of our data. So there are 5 types of constraints that I will be talking about in this video. So firstly, we have not null. So not null actually forces our user to key in the required column, which means that you can't actually leave the column blank. Unique, on the other hand, ensures that all values in that column is different. So things like primary key is unique and it actually uniquely identifies each row of the data. For this video, we'll be mainly talking about 5 types of constraints. So the first type is actually not null. So not null actually forces our user to key in data in the required column. So you can't actually leave the column blank. The second is actually unique. So unique ensures that all values in that specific column is different. So you won't be able to see duplicates in that column with a unique constraint. Then next we have primary key. So primary key must be unique and cannot be left blank. So primary key, what it does is that it actually uniquely identify each row of data. So almost each table has a primary key, which uniquely identify each row of data, so you can't have duplicates of data. And lastly, next we have foreign key. So foreign key is used to link tables together. So it's actually a column in a table that is used to refer to the primary key of another table. So lastly, we have default. So default is a constraint that helps to set the default value of the column when no value is actually specified. So if you actually leave the column blank, the default constraint will help you to input in the default value that you actually create. So this is actually the syntax for not null. So here we have create table, and then we type in the table name, the name of the first column, the data type, and then we key in not null. So what this means is that the first column will never be empty. So if you get into practice, we create a brand new table called test1. So create table test1. So in this table, we add in a name. So name will be a varchar 100, and in this name will be not null. So the user is required to key in the name, and then we have age, which is an integer. So here, after we create a table, what we can see here is that the name itself is not null. So the user have to key in the name. As for the age, it's actually optional. So we actually accept null value for age. So if we do a describe test1, so you can see here null for null, no. So name itself can't be null. And for age, yes, we actually accept null values. So if we actually insert values into test1, so let's say if I insert age only, (12 years old) with no name, what we can see here is that under field, name doesn't have a default value. So these actually cause an error. So you actually force the user to key in a name inside the table. So let's say if we actually key in the name for this, and do him. Alright, so if we do a select stuff from S1, you can see that we have successfully insert a query into the table. So next up we have unique. So what unique does is that you actually cause the column to be unique, so you can't actually have duplicate inside that column. So for the syntax, we have alter table, table name, add unique, and then the name of the column. So this is if you actually create a table already. So if you have not created a table, you can also add in this unique constraint inside the create table syntax. So let's just say if we create a table, for test2. So in this test2 table, we have name, which is a varchar, and then we call it unique. And then here we have age again, integer. All right. So if we insert into test2, so we have name and age. And then for the values, we have, let's use Kim again. Age will be 12. And then we have, if we key in the same name again, here we will actually encounter an error. So here we see that they say there's an error, duplicate entry, Kim for key name. So this constraint actually prevent duplicate entries. Alright, so if we actually want to do the alter table, so if you want to actually add in this constraint on existing table, we can do it as well. So what we can do is we do alter table. Let's say if you want to do age as 2. So here we do age. So test2 add unique. So here we actually add the age as a constraint. Alright, so let's say if we do add in a duplicate name, duplicate age. So Tom will be here. So we have Kim and Tom. So this Kim and Tom is actually unique. So it won't trigger this error. But then if we actually put the same age, we will actually trigger the error. So as you can see here, duplicate entry is 13 for key age, because we actually alter the table to add in this unique constraint for the column age. And here we actually encounter the error when we actually have duplicate age. Moving on, we have the primary key, as I like to label it as PK. So what it does is that it actually uniquely identify each row. So we can say that the primary key is not null because it can never be empty. And it's also unique because, like I said, it uniquely identifies each row. So one thing you have to note is that one table can only have one primary key. So you can't have multiple primary key, otherwise you actually create an error. So to get into practice, let's create a brand new table called test3. So in this test3, we have ID, which is a primary key. So it's an integer and it's a primary key. So we key in primary key. So one thing I always like to do is actually add in this auto increment feature. So what it does is that it actually auto increment the ID from 1 to infinite without having you to always key in the ID every time you insert a query into the table. So let me give you an example. So before I start, let's key in a name column, which is a varchar. And then lastly, we have age, which is an integer. Alright, there's an error. Create table, auto increment, primary key, varchar, integer. Okay, I think I need to put in the integer before the auto increment. And this should work. Yep, awesome. So now let's insert data into test3 table. So because it's auto increment, I don't need to key any data into ID. I just need to key data into name and also age. And then values. So let's do some names here. We have Kim once again, which is 12 years old. Then we have Tom, which is 14 years old. And then lastly, we have Oliver, who is 11 years old. All right. So if we actually look into this table, you can see that for the ID is actually automatically increment from 1 to 3, and then we have the name, and then we have the age. So it's actually not needed for you to create a ID column when you actually insert into the table. So you can just leave it as auto increment, and it will automatically add in the ID number into it. So you won't see a duplicate. So 1 will appear once, 2 will appear once, 3 will appear once. You won't see any duplicate for the column ID, because it's a primary key. It's actually unique, and yeah, the ID itself is actually not null, so you don't have to worry about, oh, I actually forgot to key into the ID column when you actually set it as auto increment. So next up, we have foreign key, which we use the abbreviation of FK. So the purpose of a foreign key is to link two tables together. So how do we actually do it? So in this example, we have the person table, we have the order table. In the person table, we have the person ID, we have the last name, we have the first name, we have the age. For the order table, we have the order ID, item, and person ID. So for the person table, the person ID is the primary key. For the order table, the order ID is the primary key. So as you can see here, interestingly, we seem to see two similar column name, right? So over here at the order table, we have a person ID. Wait, isn't that similar to this primary key here? So what we intend to do is actually using this column as a foreign key, and then we use this foreign key to refer back to the primary key at another table, right? As I've explained at the beginning of this tutorial. So here we can see bits from person ID of 3, which is Dwight, and then we have pretzel from person ID of 1, which is Stanley, and then lastly we have the magic kid from person ID of 2, who is Michael. So in terms of syntax, so let's say in this example, we're actually creating this order table that is shown here. So what we want to do is we create an order ID first, which is a primary key, and then we set the foreign key as person ID. So this is the foreign key. So what we do is we refer the person ID as a foreign key in this order table. So after which we create a references. So what is this person ID referring to? We are actually referring to the person ID column in the person table, right? So this is the primary key that we are referring to. That's why we actually put it here. So in the actual example, let's say if we use the previous table that we have created, the test tree table. So let's create another table. So create table. Let's do test4. Let's link test4 to test3. So create test4. So in test4 we have what kind we have? We have item ID, for example. So item ID, which is integer, and then it's an auto increment, which I said just in previous slide, which is a great way for us to actually don't touch the primary key, by which we will actually auto increment from 1 to infinite, and then we let it become a primary key. So we have item ID, then we have the item name. So the item name will be we just call it name Archer 100. Very good enough. And then we have let's create a foreign key. So we do a foreign key. So foreign key, we are referring to test3 ID. So we can name it test3 ID. So in references to test3 ID. Yep. Alright, test3 ID does not exist. Seems like we need to create the foreign key first. So we can create a S3 ID is an integer. Alright. So my mistake for not actually mentioning this. So here we see that we have actually created a table test4 item ID, which is a primary key, and then we have a name, which is a varchar, and next up we actually need to key in test3 ID as integer. We actually need to specify the data type of test3 ID before we can actually key in foreign key test3 ID here. So over here we're actually referring to the ID from the previous table, which is test3 here. We're actually using this as a reference. So if we actually do an insert into test4, so let's just say if we do we can just do name. We don't have to do item ID because it's auto increment, and then we have test3 ID. So values. So let's say if Kim, for Kim, she actually buy what she buy? Let's just say she buy coffee or cold brew. Alright. And then the test3 ID for that will be her ID is actually 1. So we actually put in 1. So if we look into test4, we can see that item 1, cold brew, test3 ID 1. Alright, I know this may sound a bit confusing. Let me show it to you what I actually mean. So let's say if we want select start from S3, and then we do an inner join on test4 based on test3's primary key, which is ID, and we want to link it to test4 foreign key, which is test3 ID. So as you can see here, this is how we actually link the two tables together with the help of a foreign key. So I'll actually be touching on this in the next few tutorials. But essentially what it does is that as you can see here, we have Kim age 12. So ID Kim age 12, this is from test3 table, right? Remember? And then this item ID name, which is cold brew, test3 ID, this is actually from the test4 table. So in the test4 table, we have the test3 ID as a foreign key. And what essentially I did was I actually do an inner join, which links these two tables together, using test3 ID, which is equals to test4 test3 ID. Yeah, so I know this is a bit confusing, but don't worry, I'll actually go through it step by step in the next few tutorials. So moving on, lastly, we are going to actually be touching on the default constraint. So essentially what it does is that you actually set the default value for a column. So for the syntax, it's actually quite simple. We do a create table, we write in the table name, we write in the column name that we want, the data type, and then we type in a default. And then over here, we put in this quotation mark if the item here is a string. So if it's actually a value, you want the default to be a value. So for example, if I want an age integer, and then default, I can just key in a value. Like for example, if I don't key in any age, the default value will be 12 years old. So I just put in 12. So to put this into example, let's create a brand new table. So create table, and we do a test 6, for example, and then we have a name. So the name is a varchar, and then I'll create a default. So what are we defaulting it as? So if we actually leave the name as blank, we put it as unknown. And then lastly, we have age. which is an integer. Okay, so now let's insert data into this table. So insert into S6. So what are we inserting? Name and also age. Okay, maybe not name. We just key in the age. Values will be drop. You see, we don't see any error. So when we look into this test6 table, we can see that since we actually leave it blank, it will be set to a default value which is unknown. Alright, so I guess this is it for this video. In the next video, we'll be teaching you how to do some data manipulations. So things like how to actually update your table. So let's say if you want to update a certain row based on a certain condition, how do we actually do it? And we'll also be teaching you how to extract out rows of data based on a condition. Alright, so thank you so much for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.